Hi everyone, I just wanted to let you know that we have just launched our spring fundraising drive. If you would like to support these podcasts and everything else we do at the Institute, please make a donation by clicking the link in the show notes or go to jungchicago.org/give. Large donations and small donations are all wonderful and appreciated, and I just want to say thank you to everyone who does donate and will donate. Thanks so much. Welcome to Jung in the World from Jungian Anthology Radio, a project of the C.G. Jung Institute of Chicago. Today, Patricia Martin interviews Susan Schwartz. She's going to introduce her, so let's just jump right in.
Susan Schwartz is a Jungian analyst educated in Zurich, Switzerland, and a licensed clinical psychologist in private practice in Paradise Valley, Arizona. Susan is the author of several books, but her most recent, Imposter Syndrome and the As-If Personality in Analytical Psychology, is what brings her here today to Jung in the World. Welcome, Susan. You know, as I was thinking about this today, it occurred to me that so many of these topics that are in the zeitgeist, they're in the collective, and they're taking Jungianism into another realm. You know, they're pushing it, Jungian theory, into places new and uncharted in many ways, and yet it all comes back to Jung. Do you find that being a Jungian analyst is kind of a more historical feel, or do you feel that it's constantly current for you?
You know, I feel both, actually, because I've been an analyst for quite a while, but I also feel a responsibility to update Jungian psychology to people who might consider that it has been too elitist or too segmented away from the mainstream without losing its rigor. So not dumbing down anything, but keeping it with its excellence and applicability to people of the modern era.
That's a great mission. I think that's partly why we interview people like you, is because we're trying to bring the ideas and theories of Carl Jung into contemporary living. And so you wrote this book, Imposter Syndrome and the As-If Personality in Analytical Psychology, the Fragility of the Self. And just a quick Google search pulled up so many references to imposter syndrome. It's it's in the air, it's in the water, it seems to be ubiquitous.
Actually, as you were talking, I was thinking, well, imposter syndrome is the modern moniker for this type of person, but it actually became labeled in 1942 with Helena Deutsch, a Freudian psychoanalyst, who called it the as-if personality. The issue was that she said it's with women, which is not true. It's not only women. It's with anybody, anyone, no matter how they identify. And she said it was too superficial, really not able to be analyzed, and kind of, although she identified it, she rather put this personality type down. And you see it in the analytical literature a little bit throughout. And then in 2004, Hester Solomon, who was a British Jungian analyst, wrote an article on the as-if personality. When I read the article, I thought, oh my goodness, I see so many people who fit in this category. And I started presenting it at different conferences. And so many people identified with the as-if personality. So it's the two words, imposter syndrome and as-if personality, are quite the same. And they have a history of being ignored. And that's why I wrote about it, because I thought, why is this being ignored? It also felt to me, because it was identified with women, that it was shortchanging everybody by being stuck in a category of superficial and not able to use analytical process or material. And I felt it was really shortchanging all the people that I worked with who fit into this category.
You know, it's interesting you say that, because I caught a phrase as I was doing this Google research, and it was just rudimentary research to prepare to have you on the show. And I came across a phrase called, that said, imposter syndrome is the hypochondria of the psyche. And I thought, wow, that is a very interesting analysis of something that not only seems ubiquitous now that we live in a digital culture and we are performing and we are producing the self. The self is a production. And so how do you respond to these sort of undercutting the syndrome? Because I think your book lays out pretty clearly what the stakes are for someone who feels it.
The stakes are high. The hypochondria actually is we could change it and expand on that word and say maybe it is a signal that attention is needed. Attention is needed to the person, how they are hiding themselves, and how they can be revealed. Because we have depth of personality, even with the people who feel sadly fraudulent, flawed. All they need is that relationship, which will help them come forward. So they're not hypochondriacs. What they are actually doing is signaling, I could use some help. I am a person. I have depth. I have been afraid to show it. There was no place. The analytical process helps them find the place to show who they totally are.
So do you take this as a sense of inadequacy, or do you take it as a spectrum of feelings that someone has about themselves?
I think it's both, but I think most of the people that I've worked with and my knowledge about this is that they're actually people who feel too inadequate and therefore they have to hide. What they are really hiding is the depths of their talents and their abilities, and they're hiding from themselves any good self-esteem. The fragility of the self in the title is a reference as well to the larger self of who we are, as well as the smaller self of who we are. And if we are too fragile, we're not going to be able to access all of ourselves, our talents, our abilities, our solidity, and we just need a forum or a place to learn how to do it.
So is this a chicken and egg thing in your estimation? Are we fragile first and then we develop these feelings of the as-if personality? Or I'm not saying that a personality is just a construction of feelings, but are we fragile first and then we feel as if we have to masquerade, or does the masquerading make us fragile?
Let's say both happen, because we develop early in life, and early in life, these people usually were not correctly met by their caregivers. So whoever the caregivers were, they either wanted that child to be a performer and stellar as a result, or take on the problems of the parents. So in some way, their own needs went unmet, and they learned to put on a facade. And then the school and the friends and themselves kept the facade in place, you could say. And then it became really closely attached to their essence. However, everyone that I have ever dealt with has said, I've always known I was a fraud. The people that say that are high achievers. They have done well. They outwardly look good. Inwardly, they are sad. And inwardly, they feel badly. And inwardly, they're not very happy individuals. And it's that inner space that is fragile. Once it gets a place to put itself and be appreciated, the fragility becomes changed. Psychic energy changes into strength. I'm not saying it's an easy process, but the fragile becomes stronger. Why I wrote this was not to say this is the next problem on our planet, but much more, it is a serious issue that people can develop from into more of themselves. Seriously.
So you talk about these early roots of fragility, and I took great interest in reading what you wrote about Donald Winnicott's false self. And my understanding of the false self in Winnicott's terms is that really it's based on an abundance of neglect. The child is, the environment is not reinforcing, or the child isn't seen. It's a different kind of abuse. It's neglect of who the child is. And so that develops into a sense of inadequacy that and now I'm extrapolating, and I'm trying to build a bridge between your work and Winnicott's to say that inadequacy then in an adult person becomes kind of a downbeat of chronic self-doubt. There's a great deal of self-doubt involved in the as-if personality and imposter syndrome. Am I hitting the right notes here?
I think you're hitting the right notes. What I found in my reading was that Hester Solomon had made a differentiation in the false self. So the false self, the way that Winnicott describes it, from what I know, is that there's a true self hiding in the inside of this cover of the false self. Hester Solomon, I actually think, takes it rather deeper. She talks about the void of a personality. I spoke about that as well. Absence, void, like a space that is actually has not been accessible at all. It's not a false self hiding a true self. It is the self that has been really quite buried from the neglect, the emotional neglect. Sometimes it's physical neglect. It can be an intellectual neglect. It's a personality neglect. And the other tricky thing in this is that quite usually the family structure looks good to the outside world. See, once again, we've got the split between what is the outside and what is the inside. So the family looks fine, and the child knows it is off. I am not getting the love I need, and they can't say it. And so the personality builds over what they could not say, and it goes rather into a place called void or abyss, like a black hole. And that's the place that one wants to get to in the analysis so that all the energy in that can be freed.
That seems to me to be a situation where one must be presented with symptoms to be able to say, I think I need help with this, because I certainly would wonder how one suspects a void in themselves. How does it show up? You're in private practice. And so I'm curious to know, when people turn to you, what symptoms might they be presenting?
You know, it's amazing. They say it. They say, yes, I just said it. They say, I'm a fraud. And I say, I do not put it down. I say, how do you know? I know that people have believed that I was something that I am not. And I say, I am glad that you said this, because you and I are going to watch out for where you are being fraudulent here. And we are going to catch it. And we are going to honor why, in fact, you felt you need to be fraudulent. And I actually go back to it quite a bit. I'm kind of active as an analyst, actually. And I will say, are you being real? So in our discussion right now, is this the real you? Because I want to know the real you. I want you and me to know the real you. How many people really ever say that? Be real. Be the real you. Once you hear that, you start to take steps to show who you are. It comes through dreams. It comes through the feeling in the analysis. It comes through feeling received. And that helps fill in the very early neglect. It doesn't take it away, but it gives a foundation. And from that foundation, the person begins to grow, as I've said. But people are amazingly honest if we only listen. And I listen carefully, because there are certain people, I get a feeling, and I will say, do you really feel all right about yourself? Are you sure you're okay? How do you know? So it's in a way of feeling space that I don't just look for it, but I recognize it when it's there.
Well, that's a deep question in and of itself. When you ask someone how they feel or how they feel about themselves, and then you follow that up with, how do you know? Because that would probably certainly reveal the presence of a void. And the void is something that is very associated with narcissism, that feeling of emptiness within someone. And, I'm not going to lie, I'm a big fan of Christopher Lash's work, The Culture of Narcissism, where he really laid it out as the issue that colored the entire culture. And you have about 15 references to narcissism in your book. And then I think there is a chapter on echo and narcissism. What's the relationship here between imposter syndrome and narcissism?
Whenever I talk about this, people always ask the exact same thing. So I'm glad that you got it, because I always think of the imposter syndrome and as if personality as kind of under the overarching narcissism. And there are aspects of narcissism within it, and aspects of imposter syndrome and as if personality in narcissism. And I think of narcissism as really a singularity. When you read the myth by Ovid, Narcissus is alone. Nobody comes in. Echo is also alone. Both of them lose their bodies. I talk about bodies a lot, because if you're narcissistic, you look like you're going to be taking care of your body, just like the imposter and as if personality. You don't take care of it. You're probably counting calories, counting the amount of hours that you exercise, trying to look a certain way for looking perfect and good. Nobody can touch you, and nobody knows what's going on and how you're in your head, counting the calories and the food straight in front of you. And narcissism is so walled off and so impenetrable in many ways. To me, it's just like a place that's asking to be penetrated because it's lonely. It's lonely.
So there's something else about this imposter syndrome then, based on what you've just said, that imposter syndrome is isolating.
Oh, very much. You know, this is one of the other questions I often ask. Are you lonely? Because it feels like keeping so much inside of the real you would be a lonely place to be. And it's not only lonely, it's very sad. You know that word melancholia? It's quiet and alone. It's also a word that represents a certain darkness and close to like a depression, which I actually think is also, like everything Jungian, paradoxical. And it has another side that if you really go into the depth of the feeling, it releases and moves up and moves out the pain.
So, in other words, part of this isolation is an inner walling off of the energy that you might access otherwise if you had a fuller idea of yourself.
Exactly. That's why I said the fragility of the self. So it's so walled off and shaky, tender, worried that it can't be accessed. And yet, because it is so powerful, it needs to be accessed.
There's another paradox, though, in that you talk a lot about the imposter syndrome is also very self-protective. It's very defended. And yet, you think you're protecting yourself from something. But the truth is, you're only making your problem worse.
You are, and that will cause depression, melancholia, anxiety, unease, low self-esteem, poor confidence, even though many of these people achieve amazing things, amazing. And yet inside, walled off and feeling very vulnerable. And of course, the other thing that happens is that any achievement is never really good enough. So then you have to have the next one and the next and the next, which is okay, but there's no enjoyment. So the joy is lacking. Joy in life, joy in being oneself.
Because these are layers and layers of falseness.
Yes.
And it also seems to me that there has to come a time when the persona gets tired of playing dress up and, being the dog in the cartoon, that famous cartoon in the New Yorker, no one knows you're a dog on the internet. Where, so there must come a time when you hit a crossroads with this. And I just want to point out, specific to that, you have a beautiful quote from James Baldwin. I'm going to read this quote because it is kind of a moment of crossroads. Baldwin says, "This collision between one's image of oneself and what one actually is always very painful. And there are two things you can do about it. You can meet the collision head on and try and become what you really are, or you can retreat and try to remain what you thought you were, which is a fantasy in which you will surely perish." Those are high stakes. So when is there any way for you to typify for us, Susan, when people hit a crossroads with the as if personality and just can't go on with the imposter syndrome any longer? What does it look like?
Well, actually, it looks like a crash. And what happens is either there is a split in a relationship, there is a split. It's outer is what really tips the balance inward. So a relationship might break apart, a job, a desire for a certain accomplishment that fails, something fails. And it is so connected to the ego. The ego just goes, forget it, falls down. The persona can no longer keep up. You know, persona can be true if it's really connected to the interior self, and the false persona falls away, can't be maintained anymore. People perhaps have addictions and they've gone too far. You know, you can be an addict for so long and then it tips straight over. So there is a crash. But you know, if you think about it, we never really move or change until something forces us to. And that something is us. And so something inside says, enough of this pattern. I've had it. And so therefore, it is going to crash. And the crash brings attention. And it is the attention to the psyche that has been needed all along. So again, there is we could go back to the hypochondria. Good, because it accentuates the issue and it needs to be accentuated. And then the person can no longer pretend because it doesn't work anymore. I love that you read the James Baldwin quote, one of my all-time favorites, and also because it's from James Baldwin and all he had to deal with and cope with and did. So it's got, again, many layers to it.
Well, it seems to me, though, that, when we hit this collision point, this crossroads, it's also an invitation to something that would be essentially Jungian, which is inner reflection. After years of living the as-if personality, how hard is it for someone to actually engage in introspection and self-reflection? Is that difficult?
Well, it's always difficult. And it's always difficult throughout one's entire life, which means that we always get to grow. One of the things that I have learned and really respect is that there are people of all ages who are embarking on this difficult path. And they are wanting more, and they want to alter something so life gets bigger. And so they are with the energy and the desire to figure out how they've lived, and has it been not just enough, but what else is there? So it's not to put down that they didn't have enough. It's more they know that there is something else within them that they need to do on this earth, whatever it is. And of all ages, and all ages change at about the same rate, as far as I'm concerned. It takes about the same time. Some people have, more knowledge beforehand or more urgency, whatever, but they're pushed by the self and they listen.
Is that what Jung would call the striving forward function?
We could say that. It's also the process of individuation.
Yes.
That Jung said, this is our job at the second half of life, whatever the second half means. Who knows? I don't know what that age is. But I so much believe and have learned that this is certainly an ageless process. And the longer that we are living, the older are people that are entering analysis I wanted to go back to one thing that you had said as well. You mentioned Christopher Lasch, who is quite interesting about narcissism. I think it's almost 50 years ago or more that he wrote the book. And it is actually more prevalent now than it used to be. So I think that culturally, we learn from very young to be narcissistic. We live in a culture which pushes it. Don't look at anybody else, isolationistic, stay within your own borders. There are many subtle messages that we have in the United States. I think it's true in other countries as well. But the issue of narcissism in that definition where it is very singular cuts out other people. It makes things too homogeneous, same. You can only love the same. You can't love difference, different personality, different color, different religion, different style, different psyche is prevented. And then you can only be in this very boring space, which always then needs more and more stimulation, and it can never get enough.
Is that because it is bereft of the larger energy of the self? It has, again, it's walled itself off. So it really can't reach the battery. The wire can't reach the battery.
That is the problem. The wire cannot reach the battery. And that is what one learns in analysis. You learn that you've got the wire, or you're the battery, whichever. No, the self is the battery. You learn that you've got the wire, and you can learn how to connect to the battery. The big one and the little one, you can connect to that battery. And then you learn more confidence, esteem, and solidity of being. And then you're really connected up. It doesn't mean the process is over. It just means now you're really connected to more layers and more depth, and you could do even more.
One of the things I'm fascinated by is the stories people tell themselves, the inner narrative that drives their ideas, their attitudes, their actions. Is there an inner dialogue that you're aware of that is common with people who have imposter syndrome? And then as an analyst, how do you get them to talk to themselves differently from within?
Oh, good point. Well, actually, the wording is a little different per person, but it's usually based on the absolute belief I'm flawed. I'm not good. It's rock solid. It learned so early, these misattunements that are kind of tiny, build, and it becomes I know I'm flawed. I know I'm flawed. People say this with a straight face, totally accomplished, educated, not educated, athletic, whatever the deal is, they know that they are not good enough. And what they actually have missed is any kind of positive self. That part of the battery is for sure not connected. Anything positive. And I do suggest wording, but I also suggest that they find some mechanisms, some words that feel right for them in the process of being able to appreciate their whole personality.
First of all, your work is very deep. And I think Jungians in general could be classified as deep thinkers. So I'm not suggesting some sort of happy talk to woo ourselves out of a bad mood. No, this is really how to construct a new story for yourself so that you're not in the round and round. I mean, as I read your book, there was also a great deal of rumination going on for some of the people in the case studies you were sharing. And I think this goes back to self-doubt, does it?
Absolutely. However, the way out is through rumination. So rumination can bring us into a hole, but it also can take us through the hole. You have to really reflect a great deal about what has been going on. and learn to take yourself very seriously. So when someone says I'm flawed, I will take them very seriously. Oh, okay, but what does that mean? What is really going on? How do the dreams show that? Usually they don't.
So is that to say that when people have imposter syndrome, they don't really take themselves seriously?
Oh, no. Seriously, they know they're flawed. But do they take themselves seriously? No, not at all. That's why you have to cover up. And I would also add in relation to that, our current social media, which can be a true reflection of oneself, just like the persona can. But oftentimes it is used to cover because the self doesn't feel good, or to cover because something is off. So you put up, all of the photoshopped pictures, and you're not really revealing who you are. And it promotes that kind of awful narcissism where I have to put up a false front and distance from everybody, even though I want everyone to see me. I want them to see me so I get applauded. I don't want them close, even though I need them close. It's a double thing. I need close. I don't know how to be intimate with self or other.
So you mentioned this larger problem of social media, the digital culture. And, I follow Digerati who talk about these issues, sort of like, what is the internet doing to us? And I've come out of that looking at the hard fact that the 21st century it is living in a hybrid reality. There is a virtual reality and there is actual life. And we can never really know the difference between what is fake and real in the virtual realm anymore. Could it be that imposter syndrome is just an inescapable pitfall of life in our times? I mean, aren't we all on some level phonies because we exist in this world?
Well, in that, we, I think, are charged to find our reality, our real reality, not our illusionary reality, and to insist on it. Because you see, there's another piece. As you were talking, I was thinking that people who are used to and grew up in social media don't see a problem. There is no problem with contacting AI to write your papers. There is no problem, you see, with any of this. The issue of being real is going to look very different. And so I think that the more that we are real, we help promote reality in people who are quite a bit younger. I think that's part of our responsibility, because the world is that interesting term, hybrid. Can you be real on a screen? Can you be real on social media? And can you be real in person? And can you use any of these to reflect the truth of your being? Truth of your being. It's a very hard thing to do. It is really not easy.
It struck me as I was listening to you that this is really a call to bravery.
Oh, absolutely. For sure. The being oneself is a call to bravery. Because we are raw, because we don't do things perfectly, and because we're not supposed to. We're not supposed to be perfect beings. That would be so boring. It would be awful. And yet we have this idea that we are supposed to be something that is really not real at all. And it's not possible. So people who know that, I think, have a responsibility to pass that knowledge on, so that people who are, it's not just age, it's anybody, not being true to themselves, not being interior, and bringing that joy and the wealth of one's personality out to the world in an honest way. It's a hard process.
And I was going to ask you. So you point out in your book many things that are very true. And I was reading them thinking your observations were spot on. But where do we go from here? Do we begin to... What do we do? What's the one thing? Maybe let me ask this a different way, Susan, because I realize I'm getting very conceptual here. What if there was one thing you wanted people to take away from reading this book? What would it be? What was the book's mission?
I wanted people to recognize themselves, and I want them to know that if they are imposter and as if, that in and of itself is not awful. Do something with it. Find yourself within that. Go towards the self. Move there. Take a chance. You mentioned courage. Go for it. That's what I wanted people to do. Not look at this as pathology, but this is something that has led me this far, and I need to change roads. I need to move it. I need to make the world bigger. Push the envelope. Enrich one's soul, you could say. So it was written to give people, curiously enough, hope. Totally written with hope in mind. Take this seriously. Take yourself seriously. And know that you can be, what should I say, naively all that you are, but I think that's true. Be all that you are. Be your imperfect, wonderful self.
Thank you, Susan. This was a very inspiring conversation.
Thank you very much. I feel the same way.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like more information about training programs, live and self-study courses, archives, this podcast, our blog, or to find Jungian analysts near you, visit our website, jungchicago.org. Thank you to our 2023 donors who gave at the contributor level or above. Barbara Anand, Uni Alka, April Barrett, Arlo Compan, Judith Cooper, Lorna Crowell, David Dalrymple, Kevin Davis, Dr. Peter DeMuth, Mary Doherty, Christine Foskett, Britta W. Jacobson, Mary Ann Johnson, Mary W. Liebman, Mona Manning, Patricia Martin, Boris Matthews, Henning McKee, Sue Rosenthal, David O. Stats, Lawrence C. Tingley, Don Troyer, Robert Ulrich, Alexander Wayne and Lynn Cobb, Gerald Weiner, William Wolfe, and Ellen Young. You can support this podcast by making a donation at our website, jungchicago.org.